Tonight on All 24 News Special, we track the profound global fallout of the newly forged Trump-Iran peace deal. After a devastating 110-day war that crippled global energy markets and unseated the British government, the June 17th Swiss Memorandum of Understanding has temporarily silenced the guns. Yet this fragile truce, brokered outside Western channels by Pakistan and Qatar, is facing fierce bipartisan backlash in Washington and immense skepticism abroad. As the United States lifts its naval blockade and offers sweeping upfront economic relief to Tehran in exchange for the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, critics ask, did this catastrophic military campaign simply expose the absolute limits of Western hard power? As Israel defies the ceasefire frameworks by continuing to bombard Lebanon, and as the Global South capitalizes on Washington's strategic missteps, we ask, is this the definitive end of Pax Americana? These questions and more are put to my panel of experts tonight on our 24 News Special shortly. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's special coverage with me, Karim Fazakari. And let's get started directly. So, to unpack this escalating crisis, I'm joined tonight by a distinguished panel of experts. Joining me from Tehran is Mr. Humayun Ghassemi, International Relations Analyst and Sharp Business Think Tank. Hello there, sir, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. And we also have the pleasure to welcome Mr. Abdullah Hayek, Middle East and U.S. Foreign Policy Analyst. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Hello there, sir, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. I look forward to this.
Thank you. And we also welcome Dr. Khadr Zarour. He's a MENA and U.S. foreign policy, as well as a strategy and international security expert at the North Carolina State University, He joins us from Raleigh. Hello there. Good to see you again, Mr. Khadr.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And Dr. Yvonne Ridley, Scotland's Workers' Party leader and former journalist, British author. She joins us from Glasgow. Hello, ma'am, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Good evening. Great to be here.
Thank you so much. All right, let's start the debate with you, Mr. Humayun Ghassemi. If we come to look at the hawkish consensus in Washington, which was launched in February, or that launched the February military operations, believing the Iranian state was fragile and would crumble easily under sustained kinetic strikes. Instead, 110 days later, Iran shut down a fifth of global oil supplies, absorbed the bunker busters, and forced a deal that unlocks billions in frozen assets upfront. So, did Washington fundamentally underestimate Iran's strategic patience? And does this MOU prove that asymmetric economic warfare can decisively defeat traditional Western military supremacy? How would you read this?
Well, actually, from February 28th until now, Wednesday, June 24th, it's already 110 days past, as you mentioned. I think the premise of the epic fury was fatally and blunt assessment from the Washington. And it wasn't just the whole administration. We saw that from the top to bottom, some in the administration was against such idea, attacking Iran, from J.D. Vance to Tulsi Gabbard, the DNI, Director of the National Intelligence, and even Joe Kent, who came publicly, and he said that the main reason for his resignation was the amount and the ferocity of Israeli influence on the U.S. politics. And so Netanyahu laid the same trap for multiple U.S. administration, and it was this administration, of course, Trump's administration, to fall on this trap. And To be honest, Iran's war strategy was deliberately to widen the arena warfare to political and economy. Of course, Iran prepared for such arena for 30 or 40 years because they knew they cannot go toe-to-toe with the United States and Israel on a kinetic warfare. So they tried to shift it to economy and political arena, and we can say Iran already won the political arena. If you see much of the world population are behind Iran in this war, and economically, because Iran was under sanctions for 30 or 40 years, Iran's economy was already ready for such damages to be taken, but the global economy wasn't. And the such war and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz derailed the global economy and pushed it to actually a cliff. And it needs just a little bit of push to fall into the cliff, and the economic repercussions will be devastating for the countries around the world, and of course the United States of America. So IRGC knew that. Of course, Trump was right about destroying the conventional military of Iran. They destroyed Iran naval capabilities. They destroyed Iran air power, but they didn't destroy the Iran capability to close the Strait of Hormuz. Still, Iran, actually the Trump administration handed over the atomic bomb that Iran didn't have right now with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and controlling the Strait of Hormuz. Iran have the atomic bomb that it didn't have. It can inflict pain on global economy and pressure global economy to extract what it wants.
So technically, the Strait of Hormuz is the greatest key leverage that Iran has over the United States. And here, let me move to you, Mr. Abdullah Al-Hayek. We're witnessing an unprecedented bipartisan outrage in Washington, D.C., with Democrats like Susan Rice calling the Swiss MOU a jaw-dropping, horrific surrender, while hardline Republicans argue Trump is handing billions to adversaries without securing a full dismantling of their proxy network, one of the objectives of the war, that is. So has the Trump administration effectively waged an unwinnable, catastrophic war for Israel's interest, only to hastily retreat when the resulting economic blowback threatened its own domestic political survival?
Thank you, Karim. I think that interpretation captures part of the story, but it oversimplifies a much deeper strategic contradiction. The central problem was not merely that Washington entered a war on behalf of Israel. The problem was that this administration adopted objectives that were fundamentally incompatible with one another. How so? It sought to dismantle Iran's nuclear infrastructure, destroy its regional proxy network, avoid a regional war, preserve global energy stability, and maintain domestic political support simultaneously here in Washington and the US. If history shows us anything, it suggests that achieving such 5 objectives all at once is virtually impossible. Now, what unfolded over the past several months demonstrated that American foreign policy has a recurring pattern. Political leaders, they often begin conflicts with such maximalist rhetoric, but eventually they settle for limited outcomes. And this happens once the costs become very visible, let's say. And we saw this in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and so forth. The stated objective at the beginning of this war rarely resembled the political settlement that it reached towards the end. Now, I think the economic dimension is particularly important, which was essentially the disruption of maritime traffic, volatility in the energy markets, growing fears of escalation. All of this, it created pressure not only internationally, but it also created pressure domestically. And the polls and the approval ratings all suggest that here in the United States. Now, every presidential administration in the US, regardless of the party it leads, eventually confronts the same reality. Foreign policy does not exit in a vacuum. The voters here in the US, they care about inflation, they care about grocery prices, gas prices, everything related to their day-to-day lives. But I think there's also another important factor here that we have to remember is that when Washington and Tel Aviv entered the war stopped being only about Iran or Israel. It really became about the Arabian Gulf. It became about Qatar's liquid natural gas, Emirati exports, Saudi oil, Asian buyers, European energy prices. It became international. And that is why the retreat looked sudden. It wasn't about moral clarity. It was about economic gravity. And I think the White House realized that a war of such magnitude, marketed as a deterrence, was really becoming a tax on global economy and a political liability at home. So therefore, I would argue that the ceasefire and memorandum are not evidence of a victory or a defeat. They are an evidence that political realities ultimately overrule military ambitions.
Amazing. All right, let me now bring Dr. Khodr Zarour to the conversation. Dr. Zarour, in your recent analysis, which you shared with me, you define coercive diplomacy as the use of threatened force, including limited actual force, that is to induce an adversary to alter its behavior. You argue that the United States has a predisposition to use this menacing form of diplomacy, which frequently diminishes the chances of a peaceful resolution and instead makes open warfare, more likely. So, looking at the 110-day war and this fragile new MOU, has Washington's heavy reliance on what you term high-level coercion factors, such as aggressive rhetoric, military exercises, and strict embargoes, actually completely failed to produce compellence against Iran?
Once again, good evening. Thanks for having me. Good evening to your viewers and to your guests. I think, case per case basis, of course, we have to base on analysis on various cases. We have seen coercive diplomacy. It kind of worked in Iraq in 1990, 1991, but it was a limited war. Saddam was, Iraqi forces were forced out of Kuwait, and that was it. Stability was back in order. However, I think since 2003 or 2001, when the U.S. decided to invade and occupy Afghanistan, and 2 years later, occupying Iraq, we have seen the U.S. kind of subcontracting its foreign policy in the Middle East to to Israel on one side, and overlooking or ignoring, if you will, the growth of China and the growth of Iran, who are collaborating on various levels. So I think that the U.S., especially after 2015, the U.S. With its pivot to Asia, we have given both countries, Iran and Israel, room to grow. And of course, each side has a vision of the new Middle East. Ignoring Iran's growth for 15 or so years, the economic sanction regime were not in full force, which gave Iran a lot of potential to grow, which has grown in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, Yemen, and beyond, until this current war that started February 28th of this year. I think the U.S. has, especially under Mr. Biden, he allowed the Israelis to do whatever wants in the Middle East without regulating, without observing, without coordinating different objectives for the U.S. and Israel. And Iran has, been secretly dealing with the U.S. State Department on various levels in various countries, in Qatar and Oman, certainly in Switzerland. So each side has an objective. When Mr. Trump came in 2017, he did not want to topple the regime. He wanted to basically achieve a new agreement with Iran, better than the one achieved between Obama and the Iranians back in 2015. I think the miscalculation happened when Mr. Trump decided to allow the Israelis to take charge of the current crisis, which backfired miserably. And now the U.S. administration is fragmented. The White House is fragmented between the hogs and those that want to bring sensibility to the U.S. foreign policy. And that's where we are. We are at a stalemate. We're talking about the MOU, but we are not talking about long-term solution. We're talking about a Band-Aid to fix kind of broken policy that's not fixable in 90 days or 60 days, as I put it.
Clear. Thank you, Dr. Khudr. Now, let me bring Dr. Yvonne Ridley. Dr. Yvonne Ridley, let's talk a little bit about what's making the news now. The energy shock from the Strait of Hormuz blockade has already brought down the British government and their Keir Starmer. So, as Europe braces for prolonged inflation and widespread industrial disruption, why should European democracies continue to blindly follow Washington's chaotic foreign policy when they are the ones paying the ultimate domestic price for U.S. and Israeli military adventures in the Middle East, that is?
Well, Europe is currently holding a begging bowl because its leaders chose to hitch their wagon to a runaway American horse. Keir Starmer found out the hard way that you cannot feed working class families on empty promises when the factories are freezing, jobs are vanishing, and the lights are going out. Downing Street, as you saw this week, collapsed like a cheap tent simply because London insisted on playing the loyal sidekick to a chaotic Washington circus and an aggressive Israeli military campaign. So instead of squandering our energy security on foreign adventures, we should be using Scottish energy resources to directly protect local workers and lower domestic bills rather than funding overseas conflicts. The political class in Washington easily retreats behind its massive oceans to court its profits while European workers absorb the catastrophic fallout. The Americans and their friends in Tel Aviv lit a massive fire in the Middle East, and it is the British public that gets roasted by soaring inflation and industrial chaos. Blindly following Donald Trump or any other occupant of the White House down a path of regional destruction is not a foreign policy. It is a national suicide pact for European democracies that completely betrays the people who actually keep the country running. So, following the Americans has been an absolute disaster for Europe, and it's already cost some political jobs, as we've seen with Keir Starmer's resignation.
Lovely. And now, Mr. Humayun Ghassemi, back to you. I mean, to secure the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, the U.S. State Department is issuing sweeping oil and financial waivers before any permanent nuclear concessions are made by Tehran. Now, by leveraging the world's most vital energy artery, did Iran successfully flip the script on Western economic sanctions, effectively turning the global economy into a hostage that Washington has or was forced to ransom with these waivers?
Well, I think Tehran wouldn't agree with characterizing it as taking the global economy as hostage. We saw for the past 30 or 40 years, the Western allies, especially United States, tried to use sanctions as an instrument to pressure Iran, and we saw that mainly it affected ordinary Iranian people's lives. And Iran right now is basically saying that using the sanctions is not just one instrument for the United States. We can use it as an instrument for ourselves as well. And you have to consider, right now, we're only talking about the Strait of Hormuz. I think if the war continued for a few more weeks, based on the strategy of Iran for continuing the ladder of escalation, maybe the Yemenis would have entered the conflict as well with controlling two arteries, the Bab el-Mandab Strait and the Strait of Hormuz. Iran could have actually inflicted much more damage to global economy. As I say it again, Tehran doesn't at least frame it as and frame it and characterize it as taking the global economy hostage. It's basically saying it's a tit for tat. You did it for us, to us, this instrument and this policy for 30, 40 years. Now we're basically flipping the switch. So Iranian officials would likely argue that these waivers and financial concessions reflects the Washington's recognition that the sustainable regional security cannot build on sanctions and pressure and even inflicting war. If basically the officials in Tehran says that if you want security, it should be security for all. And it's not just the security militarily or etc. It's economic security as well. If you want security, you have to want it for the whole region.
Nice perspective. Mr. Abdullah Hayek, back to you now. The original justification for this war was to totally dismantle Iran's nuclear infrastructure and permanently sever its proxy networks. You mentioned that earlier. Yet the 14-point MOU allows local downblending of uranium under IAEA supervision and leaves the axis of resistance structurally intact. So if the US is ending up exactly where it started in February, but with a crippled global economy now, how do the pro-war think tanks in Washington justify the massive expenditure of blood, treasure, and global credibility for that matter?
I believe that the argument from many pro-war circles, not just think tanks here in Washington, is that the war was not about achieving absolute victory. Their defense is that it was about buying time. It was about degrading capabilities. It was about restoring defensive postures in the region. However, that argument raises a very uncomfortable question, in my opinion. If the objective was merely to delay nuclear development and temporarily weaken these proxy networks, then the American public was sold a very different vision at the outset, essentially. The public heard language about dismantlement, about permanent solutions, about strategic transformation, about regime change, even though it never came out from the White House by the words of the president, but regime change was covering the headlines, especially in the light of the protests in Iran between January and February. So what emerged instead was a negotiated arrangement that implicitly acknowledges the limits of American military power. And this, in my opinion, reflects a larger debate that has existed in Washington for decades. You have a camp that believes that military force can fundamentally reshape political realities, and you have another camp that believes that force can create opportunities, but it can't really substitute for diplomacy, for politics, for regional consensus. And the story goes on when you have that. Essentially, the challenge for these war hawks is that you have to explain the gap between expectations and outcomes. If Iran retains a nuclear framework under international supervision, whatever it is, if these regional proxies remain politically influential, especially in Hezbollah with Lebanon, with the PMF in Iraq, if the global markets have absorbed severe shocks, then the critics of this will naturally ask whether the costs have justified the results. And obviously, in my opinion, it has not. And I think there's another group that has understood this perfectly, and that happens to be the GCC, the Arabian Gulf states. They understood this much better than Washington. They do not obviously want an Iranian nuclear weapon, but they also do not want their ports, their airports, their energy infrastructure, their airspace, their economies, this lavish environment of the Gulf to turn into collateral damage for a maximalist theory that really is produced in Washington and in its conference room, in its think tanks, in its emergency situation rooms. All of this does not suit the Gulf. But what makes this debate especially significant is that the credibility itself was the strategic asset in this theater. Credibility strengthened when the objectives matched the outcomes. And it was really weakened when the ambitions exceed what can realistically be delivered. That all did not happen in the Gulf. So for that reason, I think the discussion should not focus solely on the military expenditures, especially that just a month ago, President Trump wants to raise the U.S. defense budget up to $1.5 trillion. I think it should focus.
Well, it seems that we're witnessing an issue. We can get back to you to finish that point, Mr. Abdullah Hayek. Let me have the technical team call you back. Meanwhile, I address another question to you, Dr. Zarour. And back to your work, you emphasize in your analysis that Middle Eastern diplomats bring a strong sense of history, a demand for justice, and a deep focus on personal honor and dignity to the negotiating table. Conversely, you note that the American diplomatic style is strictly task-oriented, overly direct, and tends to subordinate history and culture to secure an immediate outcome. In your view, did the Trump administration's hegemonic posture fundamentally trigger this war by ignoring these profound cultural sensitivities and failing to offer Tehran a critical face-saving mechanism?
Yeah, this is really the million-dollar question. The Trump administration had 4 years between 2017 and 2021 to understand the Iranian points of view, culture, history, and politics, and he didn't. It took a year and a half since 2024 and still doesn't understand, the administration doesn't understand how to deal with international issues. They follow what I call kind of kicking the can down the road, that the next administration deal with it. That does not work. In the Middle Eastern tradition, you build trust, you build confidence with your counterpart. We haven't seen that. We have seen mistrust, we have seen threats, intimidations, military exercises, intimidations, attacks, allowing the Israeli Mossad to assassinate scientists, advisors, politicians. That does, and of course, the United States not only supported it, but they coordinated with the Israelis. This broke all trust and confidence between the two sides. So to bring the Iranians back to the negotiating table, they will have to use all their resources, specifically, for example, it's militias, it's subcontractors in the region, Hezbollah, the Houthis, so forth and so on. And they had used that effectively to basically weaken the U.S. position in the region and to weaken the Israeli position in the region. So I think kicking the can down the road by each administration since 1979 has failed and failed miserably, and the American taxpayers continue to pay for a war they never asked for. We have to understand the other side of point of view. We have to understand that 4 years during the president's term, you cannot solve everything. So it has to be a long-term strategy, and that is missing in this equation.
Meanwhile, when this strategy is missing, the Global South is doing something else. And here, Dr. Yvonne Ridley, I go back to you with this question. Throughout this war, the Global South, led by major economic hubs and BRICS nations, outright rejected Western secondary sanctions and actively built alternative commodity payment routes. With Washington now retreating to the negotiating table, are we witnessing the definitive end of the U.S. dollar's weaponization? And has this war permanently accelerated the de-dollarization of the global economy? I mean, to say the least.
Well, Washington has spent decades treating the global financial system like a private playground where they can switch off the lights whenever someone disagrees with them. But this latest conflict has shown that the international working class and the global majority are thoroughly tired of being bullied by a green piece of paper. The Global South and the BRICS nations did not just ignore Western secondary sanctions, they built an entirely new commercial bypass around them. The weaponization of the dollar has clearly backfired beautifully on the American Treasury. While Washington is forced back to the negotiating table, countries are rapidly trading in their dollars for real commodities and bilateral payment routes to protect their own industries. This war did not just nudge the world towards de-dollarization, it kicked the door wide open. The moment you use your currency as an economic club against developing nations, you guarantee that everyone else will start looking for a different shield. And that shift is now entirely permanent. And, you know, the ordinary working classes in the West are really feeling the pinch. But it has to be said, the Iranians must be looking and smiling because they've had or endured nearly 4 decades of biting, crippling sanctions. So, you know, they are used to this sort of squeeze and hardship, which is why they're probably able to handle it in a much more mature way than the West.
Mm-hmm. And now, Mr. Humayun Ghasemi, back to you. The MOU explicitly calls for a cessation of hostilities on all fronts, yet we can still see Israel continuing to expand its military footprint in Beirut. Now, while Trump takes to Truth Social to threaten Iran to stop their highly paid proxies or face renewed bombing, can Tehran realistically be expected to honor an overarching ceasefire when the United States appears completely incapable or perhaps unwilling to restrain Israeli kinetic aggression in Lebanon?
Well, first of all, let me explain something. Like United States and its allies always call Iranian allies in the region Iranian proxies. But what's the role of the proxy? Its role is prevent you from putting your foot on water and getting wet. Right now, we see that Iran is putting its vital interest and trying to defend Lebanon and Hezbollah against Israel. So if Hezbollah is Iranian proxy, why should Iran deal with the situation in hand like this? Put the most crucial and the basic point of the MOU, the cessation of all the hostilities in the region between United States and Iran and its allies. So based on that, from Tehran's perspective, ceasefire must be reciprocal, and both parties should abide the ceasefire. One party, Tehran, cannot just sit back and see Israel do whatever it wants, and there should be some accountability here. So Iranian policymakers would say that durability of such a ceasefire depends on both sides, and you have to understand, based on the memorandum of understanding, if Israel continues to violate the ceasefire, Iran actually can go back to closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And this time, Iran would have the legitimacy because based on the memorandum of understanding and ending of the hostilities, Iran continues the opening of Strait of Hormuz as long as other parties are abide by their obligations as well. As long as Israel continues to bombing Beirut, Iran would close the Strait of Hormuz again. And this time, as I said, Iran would have the legitimacy as well. At the same time, Iran historically presented itself as favoring the peace in the region. Iran tried multiple times to create some basic understanding between the parties in the region to go forward and try to create a security premise from inside the region, not from the outside with other parties like United States and even China and Russia be present in the Middle East to create a security. So based on this, I think as long as Washington cannot restrain Israel for attacking Lebanon deliberately or undeliberately, maybe Trump is incapable of restraining Israel. Iran can go back to its promise. Tehran can close the Strait of Hormuz again. And as I said, this time Iran has the legitimacy as well, based on the memorandum of understanding that two parties came together.
Mm-hmm. So it's a chicken and egg stalemate situation here, and let me bring Mr. Abdullah Hayek with this question, still related one. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has heavily defied the ceasefire frameworks by insisting on maintaining a military security buffer zone in southern Lebanon, heavily alienating the White House and exposing severe rifts in the U.S.-Israel alliance. Now, is the United States finally discovering that offering unconditional military shields to Israel has granted a regional partner the ultimate veto power over America's own diplomatic and economic stability?
This question, in my opinion, touches a very long-standing dilemma in alliance management. But before I get into that, I just want to clarify. From an Israeli perspective, the Israelis will never accept the memorandum of understanding with the U.S. to be the U.S. and Iran to be tied with Lebanon. From an Israeli perspective, that is an existential threat. They can't look at Lebanon and Iran as intertwined. They believe that they already have policymakers in Beirut that they can negotiate with, and they don't need Iranian policymakers to negotiate on Lebanon's behalf. And we've seen this with the negotiations in Washington. But either way, the US and Israel remain very close strategic partners. You know, when King Charles visited Washington, there was an interview with the British ambassador here, and the interviewer said, "Is the British-American relationship special?" He said, "No, the only special relationship America has is with Israel." But no alliance is perfect. No alliance is identical entirely in interests. The allies, you know, Israel and the US, they cooperate because their interests overlap most of the time, and not because that they are identical in nature. At certain moments, these interests, they diverge. And what we are witnessing right now is not necessarily a collapse in the relationship. Rather, it is a reminder that Israel's security calculations and America's global calculations are not always the same. Israel here is focused primarily on the immediate regional threats. Thus, its performance in the war alluded that it wants regime change for the regime in Tehran to collapse. That was not the case with the US. The US has to simultaneously consider global energy markets. It has to consider great power competition with Russia and China, alliance cohesion with the Arabian Gulf, and of course, economic global stability. But I think that is where southern Lebanon matters, going back to Lebanon. If Netanyahu insists on a lasting security zone, despite the ceasefire frameworks, he's not only challenging Lebanon, he's challenging the diplomatic architecture that the US is trying to build across the region. And this brings us later to the larger issue, is whether American policymakers, in particular the State Department, have they become too dependent on military guarantees as a primary instrument of alliance management? That's something we're going to find the answer for in the next couple of days when Rubio is at the Gulf. Security commitments, they're the most effective when they're paired with leverage. And from the Gulf's perspective, there has been no guarantee of their security by the US, especially in light of all the strikes by Iran on the Arabian Gulf. So when the commitments become unconditional, leverage inevitably diminishes.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Now, Dr. Khadr Zarour, back to you. Comparing this conflict to US interventions in Iraq in 1991 and 2003, you assert in your work that when a targeted state sovereignty and survival are explicitly threatened by a superpower, those weak states will prefer to take their chances on the battlefield rather than surrender. You highlight as well that the US previously set itself on a deliberate collision course with Saddam Hussein, essentially accepting the failure of diplomacy to justify military force. Did the hardline establishment in Washington repeat this exact same strategic blunder in February 2026 by assuming Iran would simply capitulate rather than fight to defend its sovereignty?
Well, in 1991, the U.S. acted with international consensus. It was UN mandate war. It was supported by the Gulf states. Egypt and Syria joined the U.S. coalition, and it was limited war to eject the Iraqi military out of Kuwait. That worked, but they kept Saddam in power and they kept Iran in check. So both countries were in a kind of checkmate situation, balancing one another. In 2003, the U.S. went to the UN threatening the French, the Russians, the Germans, and there was no UN mandate. With the current genocide in Gaza, the current genocide in southern Lebanon, the continuous bombing by the Israeli military forces, evicting people from their own homes, the total destruction, that is really in total violation of international law. Everyone knows that's going on with the U.S. blessings. The U.S. is the only country continue to support the genocide, overlook the other side, weakening international institutions. The UN is becoming irrelevant. So I think the miscalculation is when you establish norms and international behavior and you intentionally break those laws, the unexpected results is what we are seeing now. Iran could shut down the Strait of Hormuz. That's against international law, but we have seen Israel do it. We have seen the U.S. does it. We've seen Russia do it in the Crimean War or Crimea. So that's where we find ourselves. And when the only superpower until 2017, now we have kind of multiple powers. So I think the U.S. has weakened its position in the world rather than continue to manage international conflicts. And I do want to go back to the situation in Lebanon. I think the Lebanese government is sandwiched between military attacks by the Israeli forces, want the Lebanese government to submit and to sign a peace agreement. This is not the right way to do it. Israel has been bombing Lebanon since 1968. It's not new. Lebanon will never sign a peace agreement with Israel until the war ends and until Israeli forces basically make it clear that Israel is a sovereign nation. We have seen many Israeli leaders saying that Lebanon is part of greater Israel. You always find, whether you support Hezbollah or not, Lebanese will always resist occupation.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting that you mentioned international law, and this leads me to the next question to Dr. Yvonne Ridley. Dr. Yvonne, the UN Security Council was sidelined and paralyzed throughout this war, primarily due to the diplomatic shielding of unilateral US and Israeli strikes. Now that the guns are temporarily silent, at least in Tehran, not the case in Lebanon, the international community is actually demanding accountability for the massive civilian toll, not to mention what happened in Gaza. So has the West's blatant double standard and shielding of its allies permanently destroyed the credibility of international law in the eyes, at least, of the global majority?
Well, I mean, the United Nations Security Council has spent the last year operating as little more than a diplomatic laundry service for unilateral American and Israeli military strikes. I mean, just a few days ago, a ceasefire was agreed upon and implemented between Israel and Hezbollah. And senior American officials confirmed that hostilities between Israel and Hezbollah had officially halted. The result is that the entire UN institution is completely paralyzed because one superpower chose to shield its ally from the slightest shred of international accountability. Because as we know, Israel does not understand the meaning of the word ceasefire. On a daily basis, it is broken in Gaza. And in Lebanon, it's almost on an hourly basis. And while a few people are mystified by Donald Trump's continued strong support for Israel, we have to understand that that's driven by a combination of transactional politics, the geopolitical goal of containing Iran, and the ideological influence of the evangelical Christian voters. This alliance reflects several key strategic and domestic factors. Now that a fragile peace is here, the absolute hypocrisy of the West is laid bare for every worker around the world to see. You cannot lecture the global majority about a rules-based international order when you change the rules by the second your friends start breaking them. And of course, Israel is a great rule breaker. You know, we heard earlier that about the invasion of Iraq, and that was based on allegations that Iraq had broken and violated about half a dozen UN rules and regulations. Well, Israel is the only country in the world to have violated UN rules and regulations by the hundreds, and yet, you know, it's resulting in a grotesque civilian death toll and the systematic flattening of infrastructure. And all we get is nothing but polite coughing and vetoes in New York. For most of the world, international law is no longer a sacred standard of global justice. It is just a cynical Western theatre trick used to punish poor countries while protecting the powerful. And somewhere along the line, something is going to snap. And I think we're reaching that point now.
Very nice. A new point of perhaps diplomatic multipolarity, which leads me to the next question. Mr. Humayun Ghassemi, it is a highly significant reality that this fragile June 17th truce was brokered not by Western emissaries, but through back channels facilitated by Pakistan and Qatar. So here goes my question. What does it say about the rapidly shifting balance of power that Washington is no longer the indispensable peacemaker in the Middle East, but instead must rely on regional actors to bail it out of its own military entanglements?
Yes, so you have to understand that it didn't start from June 17. It was a trend started from Trump's first term presidency, with tearing down the Paris Agreement, tearing down the JCPOA, and now the second term, we have the tariff wars, the role that US played in the Russia-Ukraine war, then threatening Greenland, and now the war with Iran, the two wars actually, the 12-day war and now the 40 days war. So the role that, based on that, the role that Qataris and Pakistani play, I think, at least based on my analysis, they aren't tall enough to broker the peace between Iran and the USA on their own. I think they are playing under the shadow of the China and Russia. Maybe they didn't want yet to step into the light and try to play in the background. And you have to understand, this is just a memorandum of understanding, and it's for 60 days. At least I think it will be extended for multiple 60 days as well, maybe until the end of Trump's presidency. Who knows? You have to understand the JCPOA took 2 years of negotiations to reach the settlement. Now, and with 5+1, now we have to see how much time it takes for Iran and the US to come to an agreement. And Tehran would argue that this doesn't mean necessarily playing the role by Qatar and Pakistan, China and Russia. This doesn't mean necessarily that the US is suddenly vanishing from the Middle East, but of course, this is moving towards a multipolarity. Maybe there are some mechanisms that regional players can play into security issues, or China and Russia step in. Who knows what happens in the future? But we have to understand the unipolarity of the US is collapsing, and it's accelerated in the second term.
Let me take it from there. As we are reaching the end of this, I would like to include the other guests, and you raised a very important point. Very quickly, Mr. Abdullah Hayek, did the pro-war lobby in Washington walk America directly into a strategic trap that has hollowed out its readiness for actual great power competition, since your predecessor mentioned China and Russia?
I don't believe it was a trap, Karim. We're hearing comments as if Iran was just spreading around flowers and peace signs to everyone in the region. Iran's hands are filthy with blood. It has infiltrated Arab societies for the past 40 years. From the onset of the revolution, it swore to export the revolution. It infiltrated Syria. It killed over 2 million Syrians there. It hijacked the Lebanese state. It has taken Lebanon hostage. It has essentially betrayed Hamas in Gaza and left the Gazan people to slaughter. Where were Iran's missiles when they were firing bombs and bulldozing through Gaza? Why didn't the Iranians go in and support the people in Gaza? We didn't see any of that. So I don't think it was a trap. Iran posed a strategic threat to the Arab League, to the United States interests in the region, and to Israel. Collectively, those three came together and faced the Iranian threat, and that is the end of it.
Mm-hmm. But then perhaps you misunderstood my question, Abdullah Ohaik. What I meant is America is trapped, and I mean a lot of analysts are not going to deny that it's looking for a strategic exit from whatever it was led to by Israel. That's what I meant.
It's not a trap. It's not bogged down. The United States military and the United States economy can withstand such traps, let's say. They can remain bogged down in a swamp. It's not like Russia, where it will be drained economically if it remains in a war. The US can withstand that. Now, what it can't withstand is its reputation across the globe, whether it can continue these wars without outcomes that will actually reap benefits, not just for itself, but for the theater it's activating in. Now, with that being said, who knows what is to come after these 60 days and whether the region will see actually a brighter future.
Then when you speak about the allies of the United States in the region, let's talk about the Gulf countries. For example, don't you think that whatever disappointment they got from this war and, the incapability of the United States to protect them actually got it into a trap of realignment? Perhaps those countries would consider to protect themselves better.
Well, certainly there's a domino effect in the region right now where we're seeing new alliances, new alignments across the region in which we have, can I be seen? Can you guys hear me?
Mm-hmm. It's just a technical issue that we can fix, but then we can hear you.
Yes, the issue is that the Gulf has seen the setbacks caused by hosting U.S. military bases, by aligning fully with the U.S. But nonetheless, that will not shake the Gulf's long-term alliance with the U.S. The Gulf will remain a prioritized U.S. ally, and the U.S. will remain supporting the Gulf, but it will aim to diversify its relationships. It will seek to strengthen relationships with Russia, with China. It will seek to form a long-standing, secure alliance mechanism with Turkey, with Pakistan, with Egypt, with Indonesia. That will also help the Gulf diffuse, open a pressure valve in terms of remaining entirely with the U.S. camp, especially when there are no results being shown in the region.
Thank you. Dr. Khadra, very quickly, as we are way ahead of the time. So your research suggests that relatively weak but highly motivated states possess strong incentives to challenge U.S. hegemony, especially when Washington is preoccupied with other ongoing global wars and conflicts that deplete its economic and military capacity. Now, given that the U.S. was forced into this diplomatic settlement without achieving its core maximalist objectives, has this 2026 war proven your thesis that weaker states can successfully resist overwhelming American military pressure, thereby exposing a permanent vulnerability in the unipolar system?
Yeah, this goes back to the 12-day war last year, where we have seen American military might is actually limited. You can achieve all your goals with your military might or economic powerhouse. I think the commitment by the local people to fight and resist foreign occupation has always been a part of the less developed countries. We have seen in Lebanon being invaded by the Israelis for the last 50 years. They have resisted. And Lebanon will also resist Iranian influence interference in Lebanon. I can tell you frankly, being Lebanese, we are sandwiched between two rivals who are paying the price, between the Israelis on one side and the backed militia, Hezbollah backed by Iran.
Dr. Khodr, excuse me. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. I can give you another opportunity next time. Thank you so much for all the guests who participated with me tonight. And thank you, dear viewers, for tuning into our channel. Until next time, have a good one.